The courthouse was packed that morning, its marble halls echoing with murmurs from people waiting for their cases to be called. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden benches. David Miller, a calm and well-dressed black man in his late 30s, sat quietly near the front, reviewing some papers for a minor civil matter. David wasn't nervous. He was simply there to finalize a legal dispute over a property line. He had all the documents he needed, neatly organized in a folder, but he could feel the eyes of a uniformed officer lingering on him from across the room. Officer Blake. Blake had a reputation in the courthouse, a man with a short fuse, known for barking orders at people he thought didn't belong. And today, for some reason, his attention was fixed on David. As David double-checked his papers, Blake strode over, his boots heavy on the polished floor. "You!" Blake said sharply, his voice echoing across the courtroom. "What are you doing here?" David looked up, startled but composed. "Excuse me?" "I asked what you're doing here," Blake repeated, louder this time. "This isn't a waiting room for just anyone to hang around. You have business here?" David blinked. "Yes, I have a hearing scheduled this morning. My name is David Miller." He held up his folder. "I'm here for case 14B. Blake sneered. "Sure you are." People nearby began to glance over. A clerk at the desk hesitated, unsure whether to step in. David kept his tone calm. "Officer, I assure you, I'm in the right place. You can check the docket." But Blake wasn't interested in checking anything. He stepped closer, his voice growing louder. "I've seen your type hanging around here before. Looking for trouble. Loitering. You're not supposed to be in this area unless you're in custody or on the docket. Which is it?" The room grew quieter as people turned to watch. David straightened in his seat. "I just told you. I'm on the docket. You can look it up." Blake's face hardened. "Don't get smart with me." "I'm not," David replied evenly. "I'm asking you to do your job and verify what I'm saying before making assumptions." That simple, calm response seemed to ignite something in Blake. His voice rose even louder, echoing through the courtroom. "You think you can talk back to me? You think you're above the rules? Not in my courthouse." Several people gasped. A woman near the back pulled out her phone and started recording. Blake pointed toward the exit. "Get up. You're leaving. Now." David stayed seated, his voice still controlled but firm. "I'm not leaving. I have every right to be here." Blake reached for David's arm. "I said get up." Before David could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. A voice calm yet commanding, carrying an authority that silenced the entire room. "Officer Blake," the voice said, "take your hand off that man immediately." Everyone turned, standing at the entrance of the courtroom, dressed in a dark suit with an unmistakable air of authority, was Chief Justice Eleanor Graves, the highest-ranking judge in the state. Her eyes locked on Blake, sharp and unyielding. "Would you care," she said slowly, "to explain why you're harassing a man who has every right to be here?" The entire courtroom froze. You could have heard a pin drop as Chief Justice Eleanor Graves stepped further into the room, her presence commanding immediate respect. The tall, dignified woman's heels clicked sharply against the polished floor as she walked toward Officer Blake, her expression calm but ice cold. Blake straightened instinctively, his bravado faltering under her piercing gaze. "Chief Justice, I don't," she interrupted, her voice measured but firm. I asked you a question. Why are you harassing this man? Blake hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. Dozens of people were watching, many with their phones raised. He swallowed. I I was just verifying if he belonged here, ma'am. He was sitting in the courtroom without. Eleanor raised a hand, silencing him instantly. Without what? A uniform? A chain around his wrists? Because the last time I checked, any citizen is welcome in this courthouse. David stayed seated, his folder still in his lap, watching silently. Eleanor turned her gaze toward him. Her voice softened slightly. Mr. Miller, correct? David nodded. Yes, Chief Justice. I'm here for Case 14B. He held up his documents calmly. I've been waiting for my hearing. She nodded once, acknowledging him before turning back to Blake. Did you even bother to check the docket before raising your voice at him? Blake stammered. I didn't have a chance yet. No, Eleanor said, her tone sharpening. You didn't bother, because you assumed. And your assumption tells me more about you than it does about him. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. The woman recording from the back zoomed in, capturing every word. Blake tried to regain his footing. Ma'am, with all due respect, I was only... With all due respect, Eleanor cut him off again. You were only making a fool of yourself. In my courtroom, in front of witnesses and cameras. Do you understand the gravity of what you've just done? Blake's face flushed red. I didn't mean any harm. Intent is irrelevant when the harm is done, Eleanor replied sharply. She glanced toward the bailiff standing by the door. Please escort Officer Blake outside. I will deal with him personally after this hearing. The bailiff stepped forward, motioning for Blake to leave. For a moment, Blake looked like he might argue, but one glance at Eleanor's unyielding expression stopped him cold. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, the room filled with a heavy silence broken only by the sound of his retreating footsteps. Eleanor turned back to the audience. Let me be very clear, she said, her voice carrying throughout the entire room. This courthouse belongs to the people. Every single person who enters these doors is to be treated with respect, whether they are a defendant, a witness, a plaintiff, or simply an observer. That is the law. That is justice. People in the gallery nodded, some even quietly clapping. Eleanor walked over to David and placed a reassuring hand on the back of his bench. Mr. Miller, you are welcome here. Please remain seated. Your case will be called shortly. David nodded, his voice calm but grateful. Thank you, Chief Justice. Eleanor gave him a small, reassuring smile before addressing the clerk. Proceed with the docket. As she walked back toward her chambers, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. People looked at David with quiet respect, while whispers of admiration for Eleanor rippled through the room. Outside the courtroom doors, Blake stood rigid, his heart pounding. He knew his career had just taken a fatal blow. Inside, the woman who had recorded the incident posted the video online with a caption, Officer humiliates black man in court. Chief Justice shuts him down instantly. Within minutes, it was spreading like wildfire. Because when someone with true authority stands up for what's right, the lie crumbles instantly. By the afternoon, the video from the courtroom was everywhere. Clips of Officer Blake towering over David, his voice echoing with baseless accusations, followed by Chief Justice Eleanor Graves calmly dismantling his actions, went viral within hours. Social media flooded with reactions. This is how you hold authority accountable, Chief Justice Graves is a hero. David Miller deserves an apology and more. News anchors replayed the footage on a loop, pausing on Eleanor's words. This courthouse belongs to the people. Civil rights advocates praised her swift action, while commentators debated the deeper implications of the incident. Meanwhile, in her chambers, Eleanor was already taking the next step. She sat at her desk with the courthouse administrator and the head of security. Effective immediately, she said firmly, Officer Blake is suspended from courthouse duty. I'm recommending an internal investigation, and I expect full cooperation from the precinct. The administrator nodded, taking notes. Understood, Chief Justice? Eleanor leaned back slightly, her expression still calm but edged with resolve. This is not the first time someone has whispered about his behavior, but this will be the last time he acts with impunity in this building. Across town, David returned home, exhausted from the day, but overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. His phone buzzed constantly with messages, friends sending encouragement, strangers thanking him for staying calm in the face of humiliation. Elaine, his wife, sat beside him on the couch, scrolling through the endless notifications. David, she said softly, people are calling you an example of grace. Look at this. She showed him a message from someone who wrote, Seeing you handle that with such dignity gave me hope. I've been through similar moments, but I didn't have the courage to speak. Thank you for reminding us to stand our ground. David sighed. I didn't feel graceful. I felt angry, but I knew if I lost my temper, it would only confirm his bias. Staying calm was the only choice I had. Elaine took his hand gently. And because you stayed calm, the truth spoke louder than his hate. Back at the precinct, Blake was called into the captain's office. The captain's expression was stone cold as he gestured toward a laptop playing the viral video. Do you realize what you've done? The captain asked sharply. You didn't just humiliate an innocent man. You humiliated this entire department. The Chief Justice herself is involved. Do you think there's any coming back from this? Blake tried to protest. I was just doing my job. No, the captain cut him off. You weren't. And now your job is on the line. An investigation is already underway, and you're on administrative leave until further notice. Hand over your badge. Blake's hand trembled as he unclipped the badge he'd once worn with misplaced pride. Meanwhile, the courthouse held a special briefing the next morning. Eleanor addressed the staff, her voice clear and unwavering. This building is a symbol of justice. It cannot be tainted by personal prejudice or unchecked authority. Let it be known, anyone who violates the dignity of our citizens will face immediate consequences. The staff nodded solemnly, fully aware that the incident had shaken the courthouse to its core. Outside, community members gathered to support David. Activists began calling for wider reforms, demanding mandatory training for all courthouse officers and stricter oversight of security personnel. Jonathan Hayes, a community advocate who had seen the video online, organized a press conference outside the courthouse. This isn't just about one officer, Jonathan said. It's about making sure no one in a position of power feels entitled to demean another human being. The Chief Justice showed us what true leadership looks like. Now we have to follow her example. David watched the press conference quietly from home. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a small smile. Maybe, just maybe, something good would come from the humiliation he endured. because when the truth is witnessed by many, it becomes impossible to ignore. By the following week, the courthouse incident had become the leading story on every major news outlet. Talk shows invited legal analysts to discuss what happened, while community leaders praised Chief Justice Eleanor Graves for her decisive response. The viral video had been viewed millions of times, sparking nationwide conversations about bias in public institutions. Inside the courthouse, Eleanor called a meeting with senior staff and the courthouse administrator. This was not an isolated incident, she said firmly. We've all heard the rumors about Officer Blake's behavior. It's time to bring those whispers into the light. I want a full review of every complaint filed against him in the past 5 years. The administrator nodded, already making calls. We'll pull the records today, Chief Justice. And, Eleanor added, I want mandatory sensitivity and bias training for every officer stationed in this building, effective immediately. Meanwhile, at the precinct, the Internal Affairs Division began its investigation. Former colleagues were interviewed, and more troubling details emerged. Blake had been quietly warned multiple times about his conduct, but was never officially disciplined. Now, with the Chief Justice publicly involved, those past incidents could no longer be ignored. Outside the courthouse, community members rallied peacefully. Signs read, "Dignity is not optional, and accountability starts here." Among the crowd were people who had their own stories of unfair treatment in public buildings, now emboldened to speak. Jonathan Hayes, the community advocate, addressed the crowd. David Miller's calm courage showed us the problem. Chief Justice Graves showed us the solution. But this can't end with just one officer facing consequences. It must lead to permanent change in how justice is served and protected. David watched the rally from home, still trying to process the whirlwind of attention. His phone buzzed with a call from Eleanor herself. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice calm yet kind. "I wanted to thank you for your composure that day. Your dignity exposed a truth that needed to be seen." David paused, humbled. I didn't feel dignified. I felt angry. But I knew if I reacted, it would only make things worse. "You did exactly what you needed to do," Eleanor assured him. "And I promise you, this won't just fade away. We're going to make sure this building and this system becomes better because of what you endured." Back at the precinct, Blake's world continued to collapse. His locker was cleared out. His fellow officers avoided eye contact. Internal Affairs summoned him for questioning yet again. "This isn't just about you yelling at someone," the investigator said flatly. "It's about a pattern, a history, and now it's all coming to light because the entire country is watching." Blake sat silently, knowing there was no defense left. Meanwhile, Eleanor held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Dozens of cameras and microphones surrounded her as she addressed the city directly. What happened in this courthouse was unacceptable. It was an abuse of power rooted in prejudice, and it has no place in our halls of justice. Officer Blake is officially barred from returning to duty here, and the investigation into his past conduct is ongoing. But this is not just about one person. We are implementing new measures to ensure every citizen who steps into this building is treated with the respect they deserve. The crowd applauded. Reporters shouted questions about further reforms, and Eleanor answered them with calm determination. Inside the courthouse, new posters went up that same day. reminding staff and officers of the courthouse code of conduct. Every person deserves dignity. Every case deserves fairness. David and Elaine watched the press conference from their living room. For the first time since that humiliating day, they felt a sense of justice beginning to take shape. Elaine turned to him quietly. She really meant it when she said you had every right to be there. David nodded, a small smile forming. And now, everyone knows it. And miles away, in his lonely apartment, Blake watched the same press conference, realizing that his career and the shield of power he once hid behind was gone for good. Because when the truth is exposed in broad daylight, it forces even the strongest walls of silence to crumble. The internal investigation into Officer Blake moved swiftly. As the team combed through years of records, a troubling pattern emerged. Multiple informal complaints from citizens who described being treated with hostility or outright disrespect by him in the courthouse. Most of those complaints had been quietly dismissed or buried by supervisors who didn't want unnecessary trouble. But now, with the Chief Justice publicly involved and the nation's eyes watching, nothing could be hidden. Eleanor Graves reviewed the compiled reports late into the evening. Each one told a similar story: raised voices, intimidation, and in some cases, people being removed from the courthouse without reason. She closed the folder, her jaw tightening. "This stops here," she said to her aide, "and it stops now." The next morning, Eleanor issued an official directive. Any officer stationed at the courthouse would undergo a complete review of their conduct, and any history of biased behavior would lead to immediate reassignment or termination. Meanwhile, David Miller found himself unexpectedly becoming a symbol. Local community groups invited him to speak at forums about his experience. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't an activist. He was just a man who wanted a quiet day in court. But Elaine encouraged him gently. "David, your story already gave people courage. You don't have to become a spokesperson. You just have to tell the truth." So he agreed. At his first public forum, David stood in front of a packed room at the community center. He held his notes tightly, but when he began speaking, his voice was calm and steady. "I didn't plan to make headlines," he said. "I just wanted to attend my hearing like anyone else. But in that moment, when I was being shouted at for no reason, I realized something. Staying quiet would let it happen again. So I spoke up. And because I spoke, others saw. And because they saw, we're here today." The room erupted in applause. Several people stood to share their own stories, some for the first time. Jonathan Hayes, the community advocate, attended that same forum. Afterward, he approached David. "You may not realize it," Jonathan said, "but you've already started something bigger than yourself. People are finding their voices because of you." David smiled faintly. "I'm just telling what happened." "And sometimes," Jonathan replied, "that's all it takes." Meanwhile, at the precinct, Blake's investigation deepened. Internal Affairs uncovered that his behavior wasn't limited to the courthouse. It extended to other assignments, with several complaints from minority defendants and visitors over the years. With public pressure mounting, the department had no choice but to move toward permanent dismissal. One local news station ran a special report titled "Pattern of Bias: How One Officer's Behavior Finally Came to Light." It detailed the years of ignored complaints, showing how systemic complacency had allowed Blake's actions to continue unchecked. Back at the courthouse, Eleanor implemented new training programs for all security and law enforcement personnel. She also held a staff-wide meeting, standing in the very room where the incident had unfolded. "This building will remain a place of justice," she said, "and justice cannot exist without respect. Anyone who cannot uphold that standard has no place here." The staff applauded quietly, understanding the weight of her words. Later that week, David received a personal letter from Eleanor thanking him for his composure. "Your patience and dignity turned a moment of injustice into a catalyst for change," the letter read. "Because of you, this courthouse will be safer for everyone who walks through its doors." Elaine read it over his shoulder, smiling softly. "See? You're already making a difference." David looked at her, a quiet resolve in his eyes. "Then let's make sure it doesn't stop here." And miles away, Blake sat in his near-empty apartment, reading the headlines about his official dismissal. The badge he once used to intimidate was gone. His reputation was gone, and the world he thought would protect him had turned its back. Because when the truth is undeniable, it doesn't just reveal the past, it reshapes the future. Weeks passed, but the momentum didn't fade. The video of the courtroom incident continued circulating online, sparking similar stories in other cities. People began sharing their own experiences of bias in courthouses and public offices using hashtags inspired by David's calm defiance. At the community level, changes were already visible. The courthouse staff underwent mandatory training on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation. Signs were posted at every entrance. "All who enter here are equal under the law. Respect is not optional." Chief Justice Eleanor Graves held another press briefing to update the public. She stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by city officials. Officer Blake's conduct was not just a personal failing. It exposed systemic gaps that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. From now on, all courthouse officers will be reviewed quarterly by an independent panel, and citizens will have a direct line to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. The crowd applauded, their voices echoing off the marble walls. Meanwhile, David was adjusting to his unexpected role as a community voice. He had been invited to speak at a regional town hall, where leaders from neighboring cities gathered to discuss reforms. At first, he still felt like an ordinary man thrust into extraordinary circumstances. But when he stepped up to the microphone, he saw the expectant faces of people who wanted to believe change was possible. "I didn't set out to be here," David began. "I just wanted a normal day in court." But when you're treated like you don't belong in a space that's supposed to protect your rights, you realize silence only helps those who abuse power. And I want to make sure no one else has to go through that. The room erupted in applause. After the event, several people approached him, thanking him for giving them the courage to share their own experiences. Back at the courthouse, new protocols were already making a difference. Visitors noticed the atmosphere had changed. Officers greeted people respectfully, and the tension that once filled the halls had eased. Staff members who had quietly endured Blake's behavior for years finally felt safe to speak up about what they had witnessed. At the precinct, Blake's disciplinary process reached its conclusion. He was officially terminated, stripped of any law enforcement credentials, and barred from holding similar positions. The department issued a public apology to David, acknowledging their failure to act sooner. The press covered Blake's downfall relentlessly. Headlines read, "Officer fired after viral courtroom harassment case. Decade of complaints against courthouse officer finally addressed." Meanwhile, in his small, dimly lit apartment, Blake read the headlines in silence. The walls felt like they were closing in. The badge that once gave him a false sense of power was gone forever, and the world had moved on without him. Back in the city, Jonathan Hayes hosted a special dinner at his community advocacy group, honoring David for his resilience. "You reminded us that dignity can be powerful," Jonathan said, as the room applauded. "Sometimes the simplest act, standing your ground, can expose a truth no one can deny." Elaine sat beside David, her hand in his. "You never asked for this," she whispered, "but you turned it into something meaningful." David looked around at the smiling faces of the people they'd inspired and felt a quiet pride. If it helps even one person feel safer, it was worth it. Later that night, they walked past the courthouse, now brightly lit and bustling with a different kind of energy. New banners hung on the walls, declaring justice for all. Elaine paused to look at the entrance where it had all started. "Feels different now," she said softly. David nodded. "Because it is different. And it's not just because of me. It's because everyone refused to look away. Because when the truth is finally seen, it doesn't just hold one person accountable, it changes the system around them." In the weeks that followed, the reforms Eleanor Graves implemented began to ripple outward. Neighboring counties adopted the same courthouse protocols, citing the Miller incident, as it had come to be called, as the reason for change. Community groups from other cities reached out to Jonathan Hayes and David, asking for guidance on how to start similar advocacy programs. At the courthouse itself, the shift was unmistakable. Officers greeted visitors with professionalism. Staff members underwent regular reviews, and citizens felt an unfamiliar sense of trust when they walked through the doors. What was once a space shadowed by quiet fear had become a true place of justice. One morning, David returned to the courthouse, not for a case, but for an invitation-only ceremony where Eleanor was unveiling a new initiative. As he stepped inside, people smiled and nodded in recognition. A clerk who had seen the incident that day whispered, "It's different now because of you." David smiled modestly. "It's different because the truth came out." Eleanor spotted him and walked over with her usual calm authority. "Mr. Miller," she said warmly, "I'm glad you came. Today, we're officially launching the Community Dignity Program, and I wanted you here because your experience inspired it." He raised an eyebrow. "What's the program about?" "It's a permanent committee of citizens who will monitor courthouse interactions and report directly to my office," Eleanor explained. "They'll make sure no one ever feels unwelcome here again." David nodded, humbled. "That's more than I ever expected." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to cover the announcement. Eleanor stood at the podium with David beside her. "This program is a promise," Eleanor told the crowd. "A promise that this courthouse will never again be a place where dignity is questioned. It belongs to the people, all of the people. And it took one man's courage to remind us of that." The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed, capturing David's quiet, steady presence as he stood beside the Chief Justice. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes continued expanding his advocacy efforts beyond the city. He hosted community forums, in neighboring towns, helping them establish their own systems of accountability. At one forum, he said, "You don't have to wait for something to go wrong to demand better. The time to build trust is before it's broken." Back at the precinct, Blake's termination became official. His name was now permanently tied to the case, his career over. He received a final letter from the department, informing him he was barred from working in law enforcement in the state ever again. He crumpled it in his hands, but deep down, he knew there was no one left to blame but himself. Meanwhile, David and Elaine began mentoring quietly at the Justice and Advocacy Hub. They hosted small groups, helping others who'd faced discrimination navigate the legal system. During one session, a young woman said, "I was afraid no one would believe me if I spoke up. But your story, it made me realize the truth has power." Elaine smiled gently. "It does. It may take time, but it always comes through." Later that evening, David and Elaine walked through the courthouse plaza, where a new plaque had been installed. It read, "Dedicated to every citizen who spoke the truth when silence was easier." Elaine paused to read it, her eyes soft. "It feels like closure," she whispered. David nodded. "And a new beginning, not just for us, for everyone who comes after." The city lights glowed around them, a quiet reminder of how far they'd come. Because what started as one man's humiliation had become a movement to ensure no one would ever feel invisible in a place meant for justice. And somewhere in his lonely apartment, Blake stared blankly at the news of the new program, knowing the world had moved forward without him. Because truth, once revealed, doesn't just end a wrong, it builds a better way forward. Months passed, and the changes that began in one courthouse spread steadily throughout the state. The Community Dignity Program became a model for other jurisdictions, inspiring similar initiatives in neighboring cities. What had started as a single confrontation was now reshaping the way courthouses treated the people they were meant to serve. David quietly became more involved with the movement. He never sought the spotlight, but his calm, steady presence made people listen. At a regional forum on justice reform, he sat on a panel alongside judges, attorneys, and community leaders. When it was his turn to speak, he paused for a moment, then spoke simply. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just refused to accept being treated like I didn't belong. But the truth is, no one should have to fight to be treated with basic dignity. If my story helps make it easier for the next person, then it was worth it." The audience applauded, many nodding in quiet agreement. Meanwhile, Eleanor Graves was recognized nationally for her leadership. She received an award for judicial integrity. Though she downplayed the honor, "It wasn't bravery," she told the press. "It was doing what any person in my position should do. Justice doesn't tolerate silence." Jonathan Hayes, the advocate who had supported David from the beginning, expanded his efforts as well. He launched a statewide coalition of community groups dedicated to monitoring public institutions and ensuring accountability. At one of his events, he said, "David Miller's moment in court reminded us all that power only has meaning when it serves the people, not when it's used against them. We're here to make sure no one forgets that." Back at the courthouse, the new atmosphere was palpable. People entered without fear. Officers now greeted visitors with professionalism and courtesy. The staff began holding regular listening sessions, where citizens could share their experiences and suggest improvements. For Elaine, seeing these changes was both healing and humbling. One afternoon, she and David visited the courthouse to attend a community meeting. A young mother approached her nervously. "Mrs. Miller," she said, "I used to avoid this building. I was always afraid of being judged or treated unfairly. But after what you and your husband went through, and how you stood your ground, I feel like I can finally walk in here without fear. Thank you." Elaine smiled softly. "You don't have to thank me. Just keep believing that you belong in every space meant to serve you." Meanwhile, in a small, run-down apartment, Blake's life continued to spiral. With no career prospects and no support, he lived in quiet bitterness, watching the world move on without him. Sometimes, he'd catch glimpses of news segments about the reforms he had inadvertently sparked, but he'd quickly change the channel, unable to face the reality that his downfall had paved the way for progress. Later that week, David was invited to the state capitol to witness the signing of a new law mandating similar courthouse oversight programs across the state. As the governor signed the bill, cameras flashed, and David felt Elaine squeeze his hand. "This is because of you," she whispered. "No," David said quietly. "This is because people saw the truth and chose to act." After the ceremony, Eleanor approached them. "This is just the beginning," she said with a knowing smile. "The work doesn't end here." That evening, David and Elaine walked through the courthouse plaza, now adorned with fresh flowers and candles around the plaque that honored those who spoke up. The mural on the wall had grown, now depicting diverse citizens standing shoulder to shoulder, united in dignity. Elaine looked at it, her voice soft. "It's not just a story anymore. It's a legacy." David nodded, feeling a quiet sense of peace. A legacy that belongs to everyone. Because when the truth is revealed and embraced, it doesn't just change a moment. It changes the path forward for an entire community. In the months that followed, the momentum didn't slow. The reforms born in that single courthouse began spreading beyond the state. National news outlets featured the Miller incident as a case study on how bias in public institutions could be confronted and fixed when people refused to stay silent. David and Elaine were invited to Washington, D.C. to attend a national summit on judicial reform. They sat in the audience as Chief Justice Eleanor Graves gave the keynote address. "Justice is not just what happens in the courtroom," Eleanor said. "It's how people are treated the moment they walk through the doors. One moment of prejudice can destroy trust, but one act of courage can rebuild it. And we saw that with David Miller, a man who stayed calm when the system tried to diminish him." The crowd applauded, and David felt Elaine squeeze his hand. He still didn't feel like a hero, just someone who hadn't let fear or anger control him. But seeing so many people inspired by his story gave him a quiet sense of purpose. Back home, the Justice and Advocacy Hub was thriving. Dozens of volunteers now staff the center daily, helping citizens with legal aid, holding community forums, and mentoring young people interested in law and public service. Elaine spent her afternoons there, helping families navigate the system with confidence. One day, a teenage girl approached her timidly. "My brother was treated unfairly at another courthouse last year," she said. "We didn't think we could do anything about it. But when I saw what you and your husband went through, and how you stood up, I decided I want to become a lawyer. I want to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Elaine smiled warmly, tears welling in her eyes. You'll be amazing, and you'll change more than you know. Meanwhile, Marcus began mentoring a new group of young advocates. Deshaun, now in his second year of law school, often joined him, sharing how the scholarship inspired his journey. We're not just learning law, Deshaun told a group of students. We're learning how to protect people's dignity. That's what Mr. Miller showed us. Across the city, Jonathan Hayes continued expanding the Safe Spaces Coalition, connecting businesses, public venues, and local governments. At a press event, he explained, every place that serves the public must uphold respect and safety. One restaurant, one courthouse, one school at a time, we're setting a new standard. And far away, in his lonely apartment, Blake watched the world rebuild without him. His name surfaced occasionally in articles or documentaries, always framed as a cautionary tale. He had no career, no allies, no future in the profession he once believed made him untouchable. The power he abused had been stripped away, leaving only regret and silence. Later that year, David and Elaine attended the unveiling of a national exhibit on judicial integrity. Their story was featured alongside others that had sparked meaningful reform. Photos, news clippings, and the viral video were displayed, but it was a quote at the center of the exhibit that drew the most attention. Dignity is not earned, it is a right. Elaine read it quietly, her hand resting on David's. It still feels strange, seeing our lives in a museum, she whispered. David smiled faintly. It's not about us anymore. It's about everyone who comes after us. Outside, families gathered in the plaza, children playing freely, their laughter echoing against the memorial walls. The city that once allowed injustice to thrive was now a symbol of hope. Because the truth that David stood for didn't just hold one officer accountable, it sparked a chain reaction that reshaped an entire system. And somewhere far removed from the celebration, Blake sat in the same dim room, realizing that the legacy he tried to crush had become unstoppable. Because when truth takes root, it grows far beyond the moment. It becomes the foundation for a better future. Another year passed, and the impact of the courthouse incident reached far beyond anything David and Elaine could have imagined. The Community Dignity Program they helped inspire had been officially adopted in more than a dozen states. Courthouses nationwide now had clear guidelines for behavior, oversight boards to hold staff accountable, and reporting systems that ensured no complaint could be buried. At a national press conference, lawmakers announced the passing of the Justice Accountability Act, a bill mandating bias and de-escalation training for all courthouse personnel and law enforcement officers working in public spaces. David and Elaine watched the live broadcast quietly from home. Elaine smiled. Can you believe this all started with one officer yelling in a courtroom? David shook his head. It wasn't just that. It was everyone who chose not to ignore it afterward. Meanwhile, Deshaun, now a third-year law student, visited them at the Justice and Advocacy Hub. He had become one of the Hub's rising voices, leading workshops for youth and preparing to clerk for a judge after graduation. You too are the reason I'm doing this, he told them earnestly, and when I graduate, I'm going to dedicate my career to protecting people's rights. That's the promise I made to myself after hearing your story. David smiled, pride swelling quietly in his chest. You're already making a difference, Deshaun. We just gave you a spark. You're the one carrying it forward. Across the city, Jonathan Hayes hosted another annual Safe Spaces Summit, now attended by hundreds of business owners and public officials from multiple states. Standing at the podium, Jonathan spoke about how one moment in his restaurant had ignited change across the country. "It's not about being a hero," Jonathan said. "It's about choosing to do the right thing when it matters. That's what I saw in Chief Justice Graves. That's what I saw in David Miller. And that's what we're building together." At the courthouse, the cultural shift was undeniable. Officers treated visitors with genuine respect. Clerks went out of their way to assist nervous citizens, and the once tense halls now felt safe for everyone. Chief Justice Eleanor Graves walked those halls with quiet pride, knowing the system had been reshaped from within. But she always reminded her staff, reform isn't a finish line, it's a promise you keep every single day. And miles away, Blake lived in permanent obscurity. He moved frequently, taking temporary work wherever he could find it. His name still carried the weight of disgrace, popping up occasionally in articles or training manuals as an example of what happens when power is abused. He avoided the news entirely, unable to face the reminder that his downfall had created a better world for others. Later that year, David and Elaine were invited to Washington, D.C. for a national ceremony honoring citizens who sparked positive change. Standing on the stage with other honorees, David spoke briefly to the crowd. "I didn't want attention. I didn't want to make a statement. I just wanted to be treated like anyone else. But when I wasn't, I had a choice, to stay silent or to stand. And because I stood, so did others. That's how change begins." The audience gave a standing ovation. Eleanor Graves, sitting in the front row, smiled knowingly, proud of the man whose quiet courage had sparked a movement. When they returned home, David and Elaine walked once more past the courthouse plaza. The mural had grown yet again, now stretching the entire wall. It showed people of every background, holding hands, surrounded by symbols of justice and unity. At the base were the words, "One voice can challenge injustice. Many voices can transform it." Elaine leaned against David, her voice soft but full of peace. "We've come so far." David nodded, his eyes reflecting the glowing city lights. "And it won't stop here. It never will." Because the truth they stoku was when Daily Ford didn't just heal one wrong. It became the foundation for a legacy carried forward by countless others who refused to be silent. And in his lonely apartment, Blake sat in silence, knowing the story he tried to control had grown far beyond him, leaving him behind in the shadow of his own failure. Because when truth becomes a movement, it cannot be undone. Another year passed, and the changes David and Elaine had helped spark began taking on a life of their own. Across the nation, more communities adopted the same courthouse reforms, and the Justice Accountability Act became a model for states still grappling with bias in public institutions. The Justice and Advocacy Hub in their city had grown into a regional network, offering legal education, youth programs, and community outreach. Elaine spent her afternoons helping families who were intimidated by the legal system, while David quietly mentored young advocates who wanted to make a difference. One day, a young woman named Tara, who had just graduated from law school, came to see them. I wouldn't be here without your story, Tara said earnestly. I was ready to give up when I saw what happened to you. It made me realize that change is possible if you're willing to fight for it. I want to dedicate my career to protecting people's rights, just like you did without even meaning to. Elaine smiled warmly. You're proof that this movement has already outgrown us. You're the future. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes's Safe Spaces Summit expanded into a national conference attended by officials, business leaders, and community advocates from across the country. At the keynote, Jonathan told the audience, it wasn't just one restaurant or one courthouse, it was a system. And systems only change when individuals stand up in the moment. We all have the power to do that. If we don't, who will? Back at the courthouse, the halls were nearly unrecognizable from what they had been. Posters displayed a new slogan: Justice begins with respect. Officers underwent continuous training, and the Community Dignity Program became a permanent fixture. Citizens no longer whispered about mistreatment. They felt confident that if they were wronged, there would be accountability. Chief Justice Eleanor Graves continued her work with quiet resolve. She received national recognition, but she often redirected the praise. It wasn't about me, she told one interviewer. It was about standing up for what was right in that moment. Anyone in my position should do the same. And far away, Blake lived in quiet exile. With no career and no allies, he moved from one small job to another. His name still infamous whenever it resurfaced in documentaries or training seminars as a warning. He sometimes glimpsed articles about the continued reforms, but turned away quickly, unable to face the truth that his choices had forged a better world he no longer belonged to. Meanwhile, Deshawn had graduated law school and returned to the city as a young attorney. He stood at the hub one evening, addressing a crowd of students. I'm here because someone refused to be silent in a moment of injustice, Deshawn said. And now, I carry that lesson with me every day. It's not just about what you endure. It's about what you do with it. David and Elaine sat in the back, watching proudly. The students clapped, their faces filled with hope and determination. After the event, Deshawn approached them. You started this, he told them, and I promise I'll keep it going. Later that night, David and Elaine walked through the courthouse plaza. The mural, now complete, covered the entire building wall. It showed a diverse community standing together in unity, with the words, "Truth is the spark. Action is the flame." Elaine leaned her head against David's shoulder, her voice soft but full of peace. It feels like we've finally given this story to the people who will carry it forward. David nodded. It's not ours anymore. It belongs to everyone who believes things can change. Because the truth they lived through didn't just close one painful chapter, it opened a new one, filled with countless voices ready to rise. And miles away, Blake sat alone in the silence of his small apartment, knowing that while his actions ended his career, they had begun a movement far beyond his reach. Because when truth becomes a legacy, it cannot be erased. Another year unfolded, and the movement that began in one courthouse continued to grow stronger. Across the nation, more cities embraced the Community Dignity Program, and the Justice Accountability Act became a federal standard. Courthouses that were once intimidating and hostile began transforming into places of fairness and respect. David and Elaine's lives had settled into a quiet rhythm. They no longer faced cameras or interviews, but their names still carried weight in conversations about reform. When they walked through the city, people would stop to thank them. Parents, students, even courthouse staff who said the culture had truly changed for the better. One afternoon, Elaine sat in the Justice and Advocacy Hub, reviewing scholarship applications. Deshawn, now a practicing attorney, came by with good news. The first group of students funded by your scholarship program just graduated, he said with a proud smile. 2 are going into law, 1 into public policy, and 1 starting a nonprofit for community outreach. Elaine looked up, her eyes softening. So it's working. It's really making a difference. It's more than working, Deshawn said. It's creating leaders who'll keep this going long after us. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes expanded safe spaces into a nationwide certification program. Businesses, schools, and public institutions proudly displayed the Safe Spaces emblem on their doors, signaling to the public that dignity and fairness were non-negotiable values there. At a national conference, Jonathan addressed a packed room of leaders. All it takes is one moment of courage to change a community. David Miller reminded us of that. And now, it's our duty to carry that courage forward. Back at the courthouse, the new culture was deeply ingrained. Officers and staff underwent regular training, and an independent oversight committee reviewed every complaint. The halls that once held silent tension were now filled with calm assurance. Chief Justice Eleanor Graves, now a nationally recognized figure for her integrity, reflected on how much had changed. In an interview, she said, "The law is not just about rules, it's about people. And if people cannot feel safe in the very place meant to protect them, then the law has failed. That's why we keep building on this legacy every day." And far away, in a small, neglected apartment, Blake lived in quiet isolation. His name had become a byword for what happens when authority is misused. He occasionally saw news segments about the movement sparked by his actions, but he could never watch for long. The weight of regret pressed heavier with each passing year. One warm evening, David and Elaine attended the unveiling of a new mural at the Justice Hub. It depicted not just the two of them, but an entire community: judges, children, advocates, and citizens all standing together. At the base were the words, "Courage doesn't end a story, it begins one." The crowd applauded as Eleanor spoke at the ceremony. What happened in this courthouse years ago taught us that even one moment of injustice can become the start of lasting reform, if we choose not to look away. After the ceremony, a young boy approached David shyly. "Mr. Miller," he said, "my teacher told us your story in class. I want to be like you when I grow up." David crouched to meet his eyes, smiling gently. "Don't be like me. Be better than me. Be someone who makes sure no one ever has to go through what I did." The boy grinned and nodded. Later that night, David and Elaine walked home through the peaceful streets. Elaine looked around at the city, at the people who now walked confidently into the courthouse, at the community programs flourishing all around them. "It doesn't feel like that day anymore," she said softly. David squeezed her hand. "Because it isn't that day anymore. It's a new day now, for everyone. Because the truth they lived through didn't just change a single courthouse. It reshaped how justice was seen and felt across the country." And miles away, Blake sat in silence, knowing the world he once controlled had become a world that no longer needed him because it had grown stronger without him. Because when truth becomes action, it builds a future that cannot be undone. Another year passed, and the city that had once been the setting of humiliation was now a blueprint for progress. Across the country, communities looked to its programs as proof that change was possible. The Justice and Advocacy Hub had grown into a network of centers nationwide, each one offering education, resources, and safe spaces for those seeking fairness in the system. David and Elaine lived quietly, but their names still resonated like a promise. They were no longer in the spotlight, but their story had become a lesson taught in law schools, community programs, and civic training. It was no longer just about what happened to them. It was about the countless lives shaped by their response. One afternoon, Elaine sat at the hub, watching a new generation of students prepare for their first community outreach event. She smiled as she listened to their energy and determination. Deshawn, now a practicing civil rights attorney, was leading the session. These programs exist because one couple chose not to stay silent, he told the room. You're not just here to listen. You're here to carry the work forward. You're the next chapter. Later, Deshawn found Elaine sitting by the mural outside the hub. They're ready, he said with a proud smile. They're going to keep this alive. Elaine nodded, her eyes softening. That's all we ever wanted, for it not to end with us. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes' Safe Spaces Coalition had become an international initiative. His restaurant, once the site of shame and confrontation, was now considered a historical landmark of change. Visitors came to see where the spark began. Jonathan often told them, this was never about a restaurant, it was about standing up when it mattered most. Anyone can do that. At the courthouse, the transformation was complete. Officers were no longer feared, but trusted. Regular town halls were held inside the building, with citizens openly sharing their experiences. The staff had become known for going above and beyond to help those who felt lost in the legal system. Chief Justice Eleanor Graves was retiring soon. In her farewell speech, she spoke about the legacy of one moment. It only takes one injustice to show us how much work there is to do, she said, but it also takes just one voice, one act of courage to remind us what justice truly means. David Miller was that voice. And because of him, we are better today than we were yesterday. The audience gave a standing ovation, many glancing toward David, who sat quietly in the front row with Elaine. And miles away, in a forgotten town, Blake watched a snippet of Eleanor's speech on a small television. His face was expressionless, but deep inside, he knew there was no escaping what he'd become, a man defined by his own failure. He turned the TV off and sat in the stillness of a life that had lost its meaning. Later that week, David and Elaine attended a statewide youth leadership summit. They watched proudly as students presented new initiatives on community justice, each project rooted in the lessons they'd helped teach. One young girl spoke on stage, her voice clear and full of hope. I'm here today because I learned that when someone stands for what's right, it gives the rest of us permission to stand too. That's what David and Elaine showed me. That courage can start small, but grow into something unstoppable. The audience applauded, and Elaine felt her heart swell. She turned to David, her voice barely above a whisper. They're ready to carry it forward now. David nodded, a calm peace in his eyes. And that means we did what we were meant to do. That evening, as they walked past the courthouse plaza, the mural glowed under the lights. It now stretched across an entire block, showing generations of faces, past, present, and future, united in dignity. Beneath it were the words, "Courage begins with one voice. Justice begins when many join in." Elaine rested her head on David's shoulder. "It's no longer our story," she said softly. "No," David agreed, smiling faintly. "It's everyone's now." Because the truth they once stood for had grown far beyond them, becoming a legacy that no one could erase. Months later, the youth who had been inspired by David and Elaine's story were no longer just students. They had become leaders in their own right. Deshaun opened his own small law practice, focused entirely on civil rights and community protection. Tara, the young woman Elaine once encouraged, had started a non-profit that provided free legal aid for families facing discrimination. The Justice and Advocacy Hub had grown so large it required a new building. Its walls were filled with photos of people whose lives had been changed by the programs. At the entrance, a plaque read, "Dedicated to those who refused to be silent." David and Elaine visited the new building on its opening day. They were greeted with warm hugs and applause from volunteers, staff, and the young leaders who now carried the mission forward. "You two started this," Tara told them, "and now it's ours to keep building." Elaine smiled softly. "That's exactly what we hoped for, that it wouldn't end with us." Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes continued expanding safe spaces internationally. His restaurant, once the scene of a confrontation, now hosted annual events that drew guests from all over the country. It had become a symbol of how a single choice to stand up could ripple outward and change lives far beyond what anyone expected. At one such event, Jonathan spoke about that day. "I didn't know the world was watching when I stepped in," he said. "I only knew it was wrong to let someone be humiliated in my space. And because of that moment, all of this was born. Remember, doing the right thing doesn't require a title, just a decision." Back at the courthouse, the transformation was complete. What had once been a place where people felt small was now a place of inclusion and fairness. Citizens entered confidently, greeted with respect and professionalism. Regular community listening sessions were held, ensuring the courthouse stayed connected to the people it served. Chief Justice Eleanor Graves, now retired, remained a respected figure nationwide. In interviews, she often redirected praise to David and Elaine. "I simply enforced the values I was sworn to uphold," she would say. "They are the ones who showed grace and dignity in the face of injustice." And miles away, Blake remained trapped in his own shadow. He moved often, unable to escape the reputation that followed him. His name was occasionally mentioned in documentaries as a cautionary tale, a man whose arrogance and bias ended not only his career, but became the catalyst for reforms he would never benefit from. One quiet evening, David and Elaine were invited to a national unity summit where leaders honored citizens who sparked meaningful change. They sat in the front row as young advocates from across the country shared their initiatives, programs to reform schools, improve community police relations, and ensure access to fair legal support. One young speaker pointed to them in the audience. "I'm here today because two people showed that standing firm, even in a small moment, can move mountains. David and Elaine reminded us that courage doesn't always roar. It sometimes just refuses to move. The crowd applauded, many standing. Elaine leaned close to David and whispered, "It feels like they're ready to take it from here." David smiled quietly, a deep peace settling in his chest. They already have. After the summit, they visited the courthouse plaza one last time. The mural, now fully completed, stretched across the entire wall, with faces of every person who had been part of the movement: leaders, students, advocates, judges. At the very center of the mural were simple words: "What begins as one voice becomes the voice of many." Elaine rested her head on David's shoulder, her eyes misting. "It's not just our legacy anymore. It belongs to everyone." David nodded, watching the glow of the city lights. "And it'll outlast all of us, because the truth they carried didn't just bring justice to one moment. It created a future where dignity could never again be silenced." Years had passed since that fateful day in the courthouse, and the story of David and Elaine Miller had grown beyond a single city. Their names were etched into the broader history of judicial reform, often mentioned in the same breath as pivotal civil rights moments. The justice and advocacy hub they had helped inspire was now a network of dozens of centers nationwide. Each one offered legal aid, education, and community support. Murals of hope and unity adorned their walls, and children who once feared the system now walked confidently through those doors, knowing it was built for them. David and Elaine visited one of the new hubs in another state. As they entered, they were greeted by a young director who had once been a scholarship recipient from their program. "You gave me this chance," she said warmly, "and now I'm here, making sure families in this community feel safe and heard. It started with you." Elaine smiled, humbled. "It started with the truth. You're the one keeping it alive." Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes's Safe Spaces Coalition had expanded internationally. Restaurants, schools, courthouses, and even airports joined the program, adopting zero-tolerance policies for discrimination. His once local movement now operated in multiple countries, a global reminder of what one decisive moment could inspire. At the courthouse, now fully reformed, Chief Justice Eleanor Graves had been succeeded by a new generation of judges who carried her legacy forward. A portrait of her hung in the main lobby alongside a plaque that read, "Justice belongs to the people. Never forget that." Citizens no longer whispered their fears when they entered. They were greeted by staff trained to uphold dignity, their rights explained clearly, their presence respected. Across the country, students in law schools studied the Miller incident as part of their ethics curriculum. Professors explained how a single unjust act could unravel an entire institution's credibility, and how standing against it could restore trust. Meanwhile, far away, Blake lived a quiet, anonymous existence. No career, no allies, no way to escape the shame tied to his name. Occasionally, he saw news reports or documentaries that mentioned him only as the man whose actions sparked nationwide reform. He would turn off the screen each time, knowing the world had not just moved on, it had moved beyond him. One bright spring morning, David and Elaine were invited to the opening of the National Center for Judicial Integrity in Washington, D.C. Leaders from across the country attended. In the main hall, a permanent exhibit told the story of their journey, alongside other citizens whose voices sparked change. During the ceremony, A young attorney took the stage. I stand here today as someone who was inspired by David and Elaine Miller, she said. They showed us that even in a moment of humiliation, you can choose dignity, and that choice can ripple into something far greater than you ever imagined. The audience applauded, many with tears in their eyes. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Elaine and David wandered through the exhibit. They paused in front of a wall, displaying a timeline of reforms that had stemmed from their story. At the center was a quote from Eleanor Graves: "The law is only as strong as the humanity of those who uphold it." Elaine looked at David with soft eyes. "It feels complete now," she said. David nodded quietly. "We've done our part. Now it's theirs to carry forward." That evening, they returned home to their quiet neighborhood. As they walked past the familiar courthouse plaza, the mural glowed under the soft lights, surrounded by flowers and handwritten notes from people they'd never met, all thanking them for giving them hope. Elaine leaned her head on his shoulder, a peaceful smile on her face. "It's no longer about what happened to us. It's about what came after." David held her hand gently. "And what will keep coming after us, because the truth they once stood for had grown into a movement that would outlive them, a legacy carried by countless voices that refused to be silenced." And somewhere, far removed from the light of progress, Blake sat in silence, knowing that while his name would fade, the change he inadvertently triggered would never be undone. Because when truth becomes a legacy, it builds a future no one can erase. Over time, the faces of the movement began to change. Young leaders who had once been inspired by David and Elaine's story now stood at the forefront of national conferences, court hearings, and legislative meetings. They were law students turned attorneys, volunteers turned advocates, children who had grown into powerful voices for justice. Deshawn, now a respected civil rights lawyer, appeared on a national news program discussing a new wave of reforms. "When I was a teenager, I saw what happened to David Miller in that courtroom," he said. "That moment lit a fire in me. It showed me how fragile dignity can be and how important it is to protect it. That's why I became an attorney, to make sure no one has to go through what he went through." Back in their city, the Justice and Advocacy Hub hosted an anniversary event celebrating its growth. The once small building now spanned an entire block, filled with classrooms, legal offices, and community meeting spaces. Elaine and David walked through its halls quietly, watching young volunteers organizing new programs and legal clinics. A young woman approached Elaine, holding a notebook. "Mrs. Miller," she said shyly, "I'm writing a paper on the origins of the hub for my college class. Can I ask, did you ever imagine it would come to this?" Elaine smiled softly. "Not at all. We just wanted justice for one moment. But moments can grow into movements when people come together." Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes had turned safe spaces into an international movement. Businesses and public institutions across the globe were now certified, ensuring that discrimination would not be tolerated anywhere they operated. At a gala honoring his work, Jonathan spoke humbly. "All of this began because one man in my restaurant needed someone to stand beside him," Jonathan said. "I simply did what was right. But what David and Elaine did, they carried it with grace. They showed us that standing firm, even quietly, can change everything." At the courthouse, new recruits were trained with the Miller incident as a case study. During one session, an instructor showed the viral video and then told the officers in training, This is what happens when you lose sight of your duty. Authority is meant to protect, not to harm. Remember this every single day you wear a badge. Meanwhile, in a small and forgotten apartment, Blake lived in silence. He rarely left, surviving on small jobs and avoiding anyone who might recognize him. His name appeared occasionally in legal discussions as a warning, a shadow of what unchecked bias could do. There was no redemption left for him, only the quiet knowledge that his downfall had created a better system he could never be part of. Later that year, David and Elaine were honored at a National Civic Leadership Award ceremony. As they stepped onto the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation. David spoke briefly, his words calm but powerful. "We never wanted fame. We didn't seek attention. We only wanted to be treated with the dignity every person deserves." But that moment taught us something. Even when you're silent out of fear, your actions still speak. And when you choose to stand firm, others will stand with you. The room was quiet for a moment, then erupted in applause. After the ceremony, they walked through the Memorial Plaza in Washington, D.C., where a permanent wall honored citizens whose actions sparked national change. Their names were etched there, not at the top, but alongside many others who had fought in their own ways. Elaine traced the engraving with her fingers. "It feels settled now, like we've given this story to the people who will keep it alive." David nodded, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the plaza lights. "It belongs to them now, and that's exactly where it should be." As they left the plaza, they felt the quiet peace of knowing their part was done, and the mission would continue without them. Because the truth they once stood for had grown beyond their lives, passed to the next generation, determined to guard it. And miles away, Blake sat alone in darkness, a reminder that while one person can cause harm, countless others can rise to undo it. Because when truth becomes a shared legacy, it never dies. It only grows stronger. Years rolled on, and the movement that had started in a single courthouse became deeply woven into the fabric of society. The reforms were no longer seen as new policies. They were simply the standard. Courthouses across the nation now upheld clear systems of accountability, with independent boards ensuring fairness. Children grew up hearing David and Elaine's story in schools, learning it as a lesson in dignity and courage. At the Justice and Advocacy Hub, the next generation had fully taken over leadership. Deshawn, now a respected civil rights attorney, served as the Hub's board director. Tara managed the scholarship program, which had grown to support hundreds of students each year. One afternoon, Deshawn visited David and Elaine at their home. He brought news that warmed their hearts. "The scholarship program you started just passed 1,000 recipients," he said proudly, "and more than 100 of them have gone into law, public service, or community advocacy. Your names are on every one of their diplomas as an inspiration." Elaine smiled, her eyes misting slightly. "So, it's alive. It's really alive, without us needing to hold it." Deshawn nodded. "More than alive. It's thriving. You planted it, and now we're making sure it grows." Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes's Safe Spaces Coalition had expanded globally. Businesses and public institutions in dozens of countries had adopted the certification, creating a universal expectation of fairness. Jonathan still kept his restaurant, but it had become more than just a place to eat. It was a living museum of how a single moment can ripple outward. At an international summit, Jonathan told the audience, "This isn't about perfection. It's about choosing integrity in the moment when it's hardest." David Miller reminded me of that truth, and because of him, I believe any one of us can start a chain of change. Back in their city, the courthouse that had once been a symbol of humiliation now stood as a monument to justice done right. The main lobby displayed a large plaque in honor of those who stood for dignity when silence was easier. New recruits walked past it daily, reminded that their duty was to serve, not to shame. And miles away, Blake remained in quiet obscurity. His life had faded into a shadow, odd jobs, temporary housing, no lasting connections. Whenever he saw his name in articles or training seminars, it was only as an example of what unchecked arrogance destroys. His fall had become a permanent warning, ensuring no one else could hide behind the same excuses. One evening, David and Elaine attended a gala celebrating 10 years of the Justice and Advocacy Hub. The hall was filled with students, advocates, and community leaders whose lives had been touched by the programs they had helped inspire. During the event, a young speaker, barely 20, took the stage. "I never knew David Miller personally," she began, "but his story taught me that even the quietest person can start a revolution of respect. Because of him, I'm here studying law to keep this mission alive." The audience stood in a wave of applause. David and Elaine sat quietly in the front row, holding hands. Later, as the crowd mingled, Elaine whispered to David, "They don't need us anymore. They're ready to carry it forward." David nodded, his face calm and peaceful. That was always the goal, to make sure it didn't stop with us. After the gala, they walked past the courthouse plaza one more time. The mural had grown again, now a massive tapestry of faces, each one representing a person who had stood for justice. At the very center were these words, "What begins with one act of courage becomes the voice of generations." Elaine leaned her head gently on David's shoulder. "It's beautiful," she whispered. David smiled softly, his eyes reflecting the lights of the city. "It belongs to them now, and it will keep belonging to everyone who believes in what's right, because the truth they stood for had become a living legacy, no longer tied to their names, but carried in the hearts of those who would continue the work." And far away, in silence, Blake remained a forgotten shadow of the past, proof that while injustice can hurt in the moment, it cannot survive when confronted by courage. Because when truth is shared, it becomes unstoppable. The movement had become fully self-sustaining. What started as a single moment of humiliation in a courthouse had blossomed into a nationwide network of reforms, education programs, and community empowerment. David and Elaine found themselves no longer at the center of it all. Instead, they watched from the sidelines with quiet pride as the next generation took the lead. At the Justice and Advocacy Hub, Deshaun and Tara hosted the Next Generation Leadership Summit, an event bringing together young advocates from across the country. The air buzzed with energy as students presented innovative ideas to strengthen community trust and expand legal protections. During the closing ceremony, Tara spoke. "This movement began with a moment of injustice, but because someone stood their ground, it turned into something far greater. We are proof that their courage didn't stop. It multiplied. And now, it's our turn to keep it alive. The audience erupted in applause, many standing, some wiping away tears. David and Elaine watched from the back of the room, blending into the crowd. Elaine leaned toward David and whispered, "They're ready. They don't need us to lead anymore." David nodded softly. That's exactly how it should be. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes, now semi-retired, continued to advise the Safe Spaces Coalition, which had expanded into multiple countries. From his restaurant, now a symbolic landmark, he joined virtual conferences where leaders from around the world shared their progress. He often repeated the same message: you can't control the whole world, but you can control what you do in the moment. And one moment can change everything. At the courthouse, the reforms were deeply embedded. It had been years since anyone felt unwelcome there. New officers and staff were trained not just in procedure, but in humanity. Visitors were met with respect and care. The halls filled with a quiet assurance that justice truly belonged to all. Chief Justice Eleanor Graves, now fully retired, occasionally visited to speak to law students. The law is only as strong as the people who enforce it, she would remind them. Never forget why you chose this path. And in a distant, forgotten place, Blake remained a shadow of the past. His name appeared only in old articles, training manuals, or documentaries as a cautionary tale of what unchecked bias and arrogance could do. He lived quietly, surrounded by the silence of a life that had no meaning beyond its failure. One warm afternoon, David and Elaine visited the plaza outside the hub. A new mural had just been completed, this one showing a tree with strong roots spreading across the wall. The branches were filled with the faces of young advocates, lawyers, and community leaders. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "From one moment grows a movement that never ends." Elaine stared at it, her eyes softening. "It doesn't even feel like it's about us anymore," she said quietly. David smiled, placing his hand over hers. "It's not. It's about everyone who came after, and everyone who will come next." That evening, they attended a small community gathering. Young leaders spoke passionately about the future, outlining plans for expanding legal education and mentorship programs. David and Elaine sat quietly, listening, knowing the movement was in good hands. Afterward, one of the new leaders approached them. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "We're here because you reminded us that standing up matters, even when it's hard." David gave a small nod. "Then you're already doing the most important part, carrying it forward." Later that night, as they walked home through the peaceful streets, Elaine looked at David and whispered, "I think we can finally rest." David nodded. "We already passed the torch, and they're holding it brighter than ever, because the truth they once stood for no longer needed their voices. It had grown into a movement strong enough to live on its own." And miles away, Blake sat alone in silence, knowing that his name would be remembered only as a reminder of what must never happen again. Because when truth becomes a shared purpose, it outlives those who started it. Years later, the Justice and Advocacy Hub celebrated its 15th anniversary with a grand event. The once small initiative had grown into a powerful national network. Young leaders now ran the programs, hosted conferences, and represented the movement on global stages. What began as a story of injustice in one courthouse had inspired a generation to demand dignity everywhere. David and Elaine attended the celebration quietly, sitting in the back of the room while dozens of speakers took the stage. Deshawn, now a seasoned attorney and nationally recognized advocate, gave the keynote address. "I was just a teenager when I saw David Miller stand his ground in a courthouse," he said, his voice carrying with quiet strength. "He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He simply refused to be treated as less. That moment gave me courage. It gave all of us courage. And today, we honor not just the injustice he faced, but the hope he created." The audience gave a standing ovation. Elaine leaned closer to David and whispered, "It feels strange to hear our names in speeches still." David smiled faintly. "It feels strange, but it's good. It means they haven't forgotten why this started." Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes, now retired from daily operations, sent a video message for the event. His Safe Spaces coalition had expanded to hundreds of cities worldwide. "Doing the right thing in a single moment can ripple farther than you'll ever know," Jonathan said in the video. David and Elaine proved that. And now, all of you are the ones keeping that ripple alive. Back at the courthouse, the culture of respect had become so ingrained that it was difficult for anyone to imagine how it used to be. Visitors were greeted by staff trained not only in procedure, but in empathy. Officers who once held silent power were now active partners with the community. A permanent exhibit inside the courthouse lobby told the story of the Miller incident, serving as a reminder of the cost of silence and the power of one voice. Chief Justice Eleanor Graves, now fully retired and living a quiet life, sent a letter that was read aloud during the anniversary event. "I did not act that day because it was extraordinary. I acted because it was necessary. Justice demands courage from everyone, from the top bench to the smallest voice. And because David and Elaine chose dignity, they showed us all the path forward." Meanwhile, in a small, run-down apartment, Blake lived in total obscurity. His life had narrowed to silence and regret. Occasionally, he saw his name mentioned in documentaries or history lessons as an example of what happens when authority is abused. He could do nothing but sit with the weight of his own choices, knowing that while his name had faded, the change he unwillingly sparked was alive everywhere. After the anniversary event, David and Elaine walked through the plaza outside the hub. The mural there had grown even larger, now spanning several connected buildings. It depicted generations of people: children, students, judges, activists, all holding the same torch of justice. At the bottom were the words, "One moment of courage can echo for generations." Elaine touched the mural lightly, her eyes misting with emotion. "It doesn't belong to us anymore," she whispered. David nodded, his gaze soft. "It never really did. It always belonged to the people who needed it." That evening, they returned home to their quiet neighborhood. Elaine sat on the porch, looking out at the peaceful street. "It feels like we can finally rest knowing they've got this," she said gently. David smiled, feeling the same deep sense of peace. "They do, and they'll take it further than we ever could." Because the truth they once stood for had grown beyond them, beyond the courthouse, beyond the city, into a movement carried by countless hearts, each determined to keep the promise alive. And somewhere, alone in the darkness, Blake remained a silent reminder of how one act of arrogance can be undone by the power of truth. Because when courage is shared, it becomes a force no one can stop. Years later, the city that once bore the weight of humiliation stood as a living testament to change. The courthouse plaza was no longer just a public space. It had become a gathering place for celebrations, community events, and quiet reflection. People from all over the country visited to see where one man's dignity had sparked a national movement. David and Elaine had stepped back completely from public life. They lived quietly now, spending their mornings in the garden and their evenings on the porch. But even in retirement, they received letters, handwritten notes from students, families, and young leaders who had been touched by their story. One day, Elaine opened an envelope postmarked from another state. Inside was a photograph of a new justice and advocacy hub built in a small, rural town. On the back was a simple message. Because of you, we built this. Because of you, we believe justice can belong to everyone. She smiled softly, showing it to David. They're still building, she whispered. Meanwhile, Deshaun had become one of the most respected civil rights lawyers in the country. He stood on the steps of the Supreme Court after arguing a major case on equal access to legal representation. Reporters crowded around him, asking what inspired him to dedicate his career to justice. It started with a man named David Miller, he said. He taught me that silence is not an option when dignity is on the line. Everything I do now is because he showed me what quiet courage looks like. Across the globe, Jonathan Hayes' Safe Spaces Coalition reached its highest milestone yet, certifications, in over 20 countries. At an international conference, he spoke humbly, still recalling the night it all began. I just stood up for someone in my restaurant, Jonathan said. But David and Elaine carried it further than I ever could. They showed us all that change doesn't come from one grand gesture. It comes from the moment you refuse to accept what's wrong. Back in their city, the courthouse was now considered a model of integrity. A permanent exhibit inside displayed the viral video that had started it all, along with stories of the reforms that followed. Tour groups visited regularly. Teachers brought students to learn about civic responsibility, and new officers were taught that their duty began with respect. And far away, Blake remained in complete obscurity. His name surfaced only in history lessons as a cautionary tale, a reminder that authority without integrity is destined to fall. He lived in silence, knowing the world he once controlled had rebuilt itself, stronger without him. One sunny afternoon, David and Elaine returned to the plaza for the unveiling of the Global Justice Tree, a monument built to honor those who sparked change. The tree sculpture was made of intertwined metal branches, each engraved with names of people from around the world who had fought for dignity. At the center of the sculpture, in simple letters, was their inscription, "One act of courage can echo forever." The crowd applauded as the monument was revealed. Young leaders stood proudly beside it, ready to carry the mission forward. Elaine leaned gently on David's arm, her eyes misting with quiet emotion. "It feels like the story is finally complete," she said softly. David nodded, a peaceful smile crossing his face. "It's not complete. It's just no longer ours to tell. They're writing the next chapters now." That evening, they sat on their porch, listening to the peaceful sounds of their neighborhood. Children laughed in the distance. In the city, lights glowed softly against the horizon. Elaine rested her head on David's shoulder. We can finally rest, knowing it's in good hands. David smiled faintly, and knowing it will outlast all of us, because the truth they once stood for had become bigger than two lives, bigger than one courthouse, bigger than one city. It had become a legacy, alive, growing, and carried by countless voices determined to keep it alive. And miles away, Blake sat in silence, a forgotten relic of a past that no longer had a place in the future. Because when truth becomes a movement, it doesn't just change the world once. It keeps changing it forever.